Welcome back to another week of Power Metal Point. This episode is going to be a lot more about information and a lot less about me making fun of Lars and Lulu. The reason I created this episode was I wanted to come up with something that I wish would have existed when I first started playing guitar. Okay, before we get into this one, I need to preface this video with the fact that I'm not a gearhead. Many of you watching this video are going to know a lot more about this stuff than I do. I'm by no means an expert on guitar repair or the inner workings of guitars, but I know what I like and what generally works in terms of getting a great metal tone. Some examples of guitar metal tones that I like include those found on Dream Evil's Dragon Slayer, Theocracy's Mirror of Souls, Ailstorm's Black Sails at Midnight, Siam's Prayer, and Megadeth's Endgame, to name just a few. Some guitar tones I don't like include Randy Rhodes's, great guitar player but horrible tone, and Yngwie's rhythm tone on Perpetual Flame are just two examples off the top of my head. The point of this video is not to be a comprehensive gear list for metal guitarists. Rather, it's to help out beginners looking to upgrade their $100 Yamaha or Squier starter guitar, as well as people who generally don't know a lot about guitars looking to buy one. So with that said, let's get started. First things first, the most important thing for you to consider when buying a guitar, amp, pedals, or anything else is your budget. There's no point in me talking about a $1,200 guitar and an amp and cabinet that costs $3,000 if you don't have the money for it. It's a bad economy, and most kids and teenagers just don't have a lot of money to spend to begin with. If you're looking to buy your very first guitar, I always recommend people look to sidestep the $100 Yamaha package, especially if the person is into metal. I know it's tempting. $100 for an amp and guitar is dirt cheap and is worth it if the person you're buying it for isn't sure that they want to stick with practicing the guitar for years to come. For younger kids who are going to abuse the guitar and may not take an interest in it, this may be the best way to go. But the inherent problem is, if they do find themselves enjoying guitar and start to get pretty good, you've got a clunker on your hands and will quickly outgrow it for several reasons. Generally, the amp you get with it is only 10 watts or so for one thing, that isn't loud enough to play with drums and the rest of a band, but also the tones from the amp just aren't very good. The instrument cables those amps tend to come with are made poorly, and they tend to fall apart in a month or two with moderate usage. Most cables should last you a year or longer. In regards to the guitar itself, it's usually made out of a cheap wood, which makes for a brittle tone and usually has very poor electronics or pickups inside. Actually, let's start by talking more about those. Pickups are essentially magnets which pick up the vibrations from the nickel or steel wound strings and electrically send out the signals to an amplifier. There are two main kinds of pickups, single coil and humbucker. Single coil pickups are snappier and warmer sounding and are great for blues and clean guitar playing, the kind that sounds like an acoustic guitar without distortion. The biggest problem for this type of pickup is that they can pick up stray radio signals and are prone to buzzing, especially when used with distortion. For metal, we generally want the other kind, a humbucker. Some metal guitarists like Malmsteen and Kirk Hammett have used single coil pickups with distortion, although most metal guitarists would agree with me about going with humbuckers. Humbuckers share a magnet at their base which helps to cancel out stray frequencies, essentially removing the buzzing or hum. For this reason, they generally get a more pleasing tone for metal distortion and create much less buzz when your guitar is muted. For metal, I recommend Seymour Duncan JB pickups in the bridge or DiMarzio's. If you have a single coil and you want to put in a humbucker instead, I would recommend replacing it with a Seymour Duncan Hot Rail, which has a humbucker the size of a single coil pickup and makes for a rather easy install. Both humbuckers and single coil pickups are what's known as passive pickups. Another kind of pickup is the active pickup. Actives use a battery which helps to boost their signal, which can be louder than a passive pickup. They generally sound fuller and have less feedback, although in my own experience with EMG 81 active pickups, I found they too have quite a bit of feedback. A major drawback of actives is that they tend to have an increased magnetic tension on the string, which reduces sustain, especially when doing finger tapping and trills. It can also be said that actives sound a bit fake. With that said, neither active or passive is better for metal. Actives will sound really good for distorted metal rhythm guitar though. An active pickup that I recommend is an EMG 81 in the bridge pickup. So, let's say you're at the music store and you found a cool looking guitar with humbuckers and you're interested in purchasing a guitar worth a week's wages. There are a number of things to consider. One is the shape of the body. Personally, I've always preferred the Stratocaster body. It's comfortable for both standing and sitting. It usually positions your arms squarely where it needs to be, and for the most part, they look pretty good. Flying V's, Explorers, and Warlocks all look really cool, but you need to try the guitar both standing and sitting. Sitting especially because you're likely going to be doing most of your playing in that position to learn songs and practice. Telecasters tend to be pretty good for standing and sitting, but aren't quite as balanced as Strat bodies. The next thing to consider is the headstock. Where are the tuning pegs located? Personally, I've always preferred to have all 6 in a row rather than the 3 and 3 configuration, 2 and 4, and so on. Does the headstock have locking tuners? They make changing strings a breeze, and you can usually change strings 2 to 3 times faster than you can with traditional winding tuners. Now let's look at the bridge and the nut. The nut is the piece of plastic at the end of the fretboard which holds the strings in place. It's usually made out of plastic, but some higher-end guitars use bone, which I have on one of my guitars. It's durable as hell and is very unlikely to break. If you notice the nut has a lock on it, this is called a Floyd Rose. They can make the guitar a major pain to tune, and I recommend against it if you change tunings frequently, such as going from standard to drop D. If you go to drop D with a Floyd, you have to first remove the lock on the nut, which takes a while, then retune the string, then reattach the lock on the nut, screw it back on, then fine-tune the guitar. However, if you're a lead player, they can be fantastic because when using a whammy bar, the guitar stays in tune almost perfectly, much better than a non-Floyd guitar. The next part we're going to talk about is the bridge. This is where your hand rests and where the strings are fed through. A bridge that does not feature a whammy bar is called a fixed bridge, as it is unable to move up and down. A bridge which features a whammy bar is called a floating bridge and moves up and down when the whammy bar is pulled and pushed on. If you have a locking nut, the bridge will also have mini tuning knobs for fine-tuning your guitar after you've locked the strings in place. If you turn your guitar's body over, you can look for a couple of things. If you have a floating bridge, look at how many springs are on the back of the body in front of where the strings are fed through. For using a whammy bar, usually 3 are recommended as they don't put a lot of tension on the bridge and you're less likely to break strings. Personally, I seldom use a whammy bar, so I add an extra 2 springs to the back of my guitar because it helps keep your guitar in tune a little bit better. If you plan on using a whammy, however, I would recommend against adding the springs. Also on the back is usually a plastic cover where you can access the electronics should you ever need to fix them. And if there's active pickups, you'll also find a cover for a 9-volt battery slot. Where the body meets the neck, you'll find one of 2 styles. There's bolt-on and set-in necks. Personally, I find the difference is a matter of taste. However, some claim that set-ins have a thicker tone and better sustain. I'm quite happy with my bolt-on necks though, as you can have arguably easier access to higher frets as the curve of the neck where it meets the body on a set-in neck can fatten that part of the neck, making higher frets a little bit more difficult to reach. Now it's time to talk about the neck itself. When trying out a guitar, unless you're looking for a very specific tone, the type of wood is a matter of taste and part of the particular look you're going for. The most important factor is how the neck plays. Can you bend well? How does it feel playing fast? How about finger picking? Playing chords? If a guitar feels like crap to play, all of the best pickups in the world aren't going to make it any better. You can usually add a better pickup to improve the tone later on, but if the neck plays like crap, it's going to be that much harder to pull off a flawless performance. Some guitarists like Yngwie prefer a scalloped neck, which has a type of scoop between each fret creating a U shape. Shredders prefer this style because your fingers don't come in contact with the fretboard, only the strings. I can't really give a recommendation about whether or not to scallop, but it's not particularly common for most guitars, and a traditional fretboard is probably your best bet. There are three types of wood found in the majority of guitar necks. Rosewood is the cheapest and most used wood in cheaper guitars, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's an inferior wood or worse neck. Rosewood is usually a dark brown, reddish brown, or almost black. The tones from rosewood tend to be darker and rounder, whereas maple tends to be a bit brighter with more attack, and is more common in blues and clean playing because of the snappiness of the wood. Maple also tends to show more wear as the guitar gets older and is played more, but rosewood is more porous, so your skin's oils tend to seep in more. Ebony is the third kind of wood, which is found in really high-end guitars such as Flying V's and Gibsons. It's a black wood which is rather expensive and much more difficult for luthiers to work, and as such, they have a very strong and crisp tone with a lot of attack. Every year or two, you're going to want to give your guitar a tune-up. If you're buying a new high-end guitar, I recommend getting this done immediately after buying it, which is otherwise known as a setup. This includes several things. First of all, whoever is doing the setup is going to remove all of the strings and clean the gunk off the fretboard and polish it. Next, they're going to dust off the electronics and fix any loose wires with your pickups, as well as bring the pickups up or down as they need to be sitting relative to the strings. You can also ask that they intonate your guitar and, if needed, adjust your action. Action is how high or low the strings sit on your fretboard. Lower action is better for shredding, but is prone to certain frets buzzing when played, and when bending other notes, certain frets can die out during a bend, otherwise known as fretting out. On the other end of the spectrum, if you have really high action, this can make the guitar much harder to play and almost puts a handicap on playing. You want to try and find a balance where the strings are almost on the fretboard but also don't buzz or fret out. Intonation involves making sure that your guitar is in tune with itself. You can play all the strings open and have everything perfectly tuned, and then when you go to play a chord like a G chord, you'll find that your guitar might sound off. This means that your guitar needs to be intonated, and you should do this every couple of months under moderate playing. To do this, you need a tuner, and I recommend using the software called G-Tune because it has a hypersensitive tuning needle, which is very accurate. If you have a floating bridge with screws at the end that have little springs on them, you can adjust your intonation in the following way. Get your guitar plugged into your tuner, or G-Tune, and make sure that the guitar is fully in tune. Now play an open string, get that perfectly tuned up. Now play the 12th fret on the same string, which is an octave higher than the open string. The needle should line up in exactly the same spot, and your guitar should still be perfectly in tune. If it's not perfectly in tune, use a screwdriver and turn the screw attached to the spring, looser if it's sharp, and tighter if the 12th fret is flat. Keep doing this until the open string and the 12th fret on the same string match. One more thing. Make sure to tell whoever intonates your guitar what tuning you generally play in. If you play your guitar a whole step down, intonating your guitar in standard tuning will be a waste of time, and your guitar won't be as in tune with itself as it otherwise could be. Okay, so now that we've got the basics of a guitar down, let's talk about amps. Obviously, if this is your first guitar, you're going to want to cheap out. I can't blame you, but I will recommend a few things. The first thing is to check Kijiji, Craigslist, pawn shops, and the used section of music stores. You can usually find great amps, guitars, and cables for cheaper than buying new. For beginners, I would recommend getting an amp that's at least 30 watts if they're serious. An amp that's about 15 watts or less will struggle competing with other instruments like drums if they ever plan on jamming with musicians or playing in a live or recital setting. The next thing to look at in an amp are the effects. Most amps have two channels, clean and distorted, which is sometimes called overdrive. Technically, overdrive is different than distortion, but for the sake of this video, we're going to pretend they're the same thing. These two channels are otherwise known as high gain, distortion, and low gain, clean. Aside from a gain knob or distortion knob, equalizer knobs, which include treble and bass, and a master volume knob, it's good to look for other effects as well in an amp. A reverb knob is a nice touch which can make the guitar sound echoey or wet. There are a number of amps like the Line 6 Spider which include a number of built-in effects. Some of these effects include delay, a phaser, chorus, a built-in tuner, and other goodies. These can be great for beginner guitarists who don't know about these effects. Most cheaper amps under 100 watts are usually a combo amp, meaning the head and speaker are in the same cabinet. For those that want to go louder, you generally need a head and a cabinet. There are two different types of heads based on the power section of the amp. There's solid state and tube, which use vacuum tubes in the preamp section of the amp. A 100 watt tube amp will be roughly 2 to 3 times louder than a 100 watt solid state amp. Most purists will argue, and I'll back them up on this, that tube amps just generally sound better for distortion. The tone is fuller, and if you want to play heavy music, that's the tone you're looking for. Some advantages of solid state heads, however, are that they generally tend to be much cheaper than tube amps and warm up almost instantly. Tube amps can take a minute or longer for the tubes to heat up, and the tubes need to be replaced every couple of years. A few tube heads that I recommend include the PV5150 or 6505. For the 5150, I recommend the Mark I or the 6505 regular edition, not the Plus, particularly because the rhythm tone on the Mark I and non-Plus sound a little bit better, although the Plus and Mark II are actually a bit better for leads. The Mesa Boogie dual rectifier is also really good, which I've used in recording. The Engel Fireball or Powerball, as well as the Crank Revolution, I've tried in several music stores, and they're really good as well, although they tend to be quite expensive. A cheaper tube amp, which sounds kind of like a hot-rodded Marshall, is the PV Windsor. For solid state, there are a number of heads, but I happen to own a Randall RH100, and it gets a great metal tone, but it isn't quite as loud as most tube amps. If doom or sludge metal is your thing, if you can find a vintage Sun Beta lead, they're very good for that type of music. Oh, and one more thing to mention to help you get a great metal tone: back off the gain and distortion. I know this may seem counterintuitive, but trust me, your tone should come from volume, not loading it with gain. Too much gain creates a fizzy sound, which sounds really bad. We want a full tone, which doesn't sound fizzy. Many younger guitarists will crank the gain to mask their playing, or otherwise they just don't know how to get a proper tone. Back off the gain, practice your palm muting, and work on your technique. You'll be a much better player for it, and when you get into the studio, the engineer will likely run you through a tube amp with the gain fairly low. On my PV5150, even for leads, I usually never have it past about 4 out of 10. For cabinets, I recommend a Mesa Boogie cabinet, Engel cabinets, or Marshall 1960 lead cabinets. There are a number of other great ones, but I'm not really that familiar with them. The cabinet should be made out of a durable wood, and one thing I recommend is that your cabinet have wheels or you plan to add them later. Carrying a cabinet can be a huge pain going to and from gigs. The most important factor for the cabinet, though, is what's inside, the speakers. For metal, most studio owners recommend using Celestion Vintage 30s, which sound rather dark and are fantastic for rhythms and studio work. In a live setting, Celestion 75s tend to work a bit better. These tend to be a bit brighter sounding and have more high-end, making them work better in a live setting because they'll cut through the music better. Sheffield speakers are also pretty decent, but I prefer 30s or 75s to those. Andy Sneap, on the other hand, swears by greenback speakers, but I don't know very much about them other than they were used on Megadeth's Endgame album. If you're just going to buy one cabinet instead of two, try getting a slanted cabinet, as it'll cut through much better in a live setting because the speakers are aimed towards your head rather than at your waist. As for pedals, I'm not really much of a pedal guy, but there is one pedal which is a mandatory purchase. If your amp doesn't have a built-in tuner, I highly recommend getting a tuning pedal. Little $10 tuners you can buy are okay, but the battery tends to die out quickly on those, and most are rather temperamental. They only work when they want to. Smartphones have tuning software, but it needs to be absolutely quiet for the mic to pick up your guitar. Pedal tuners last a long time, and most chromatic tuners are insanely accurate because your guitar is plugged right into them. I recommend getting the Boss TU2 or TU3 chromatic tuner. It'll be the best $75 to $100 you ever spend. When it comes to plugging in your pedals into a head, plug them into the effects send and return spot in the back of your amp rather than in the input. Guitar effects act like a chain, and the one before it affects the one that follows. If you add reverb before distortion, for example, your tone is going to be all screwed up. Better to plug into your amp, let the tone distort with your head, and then send it out to effects, and then have it come back into the return and through your master volume. If you're plugging in a tuning pedal, though, you can have your guitar go into the tuning pedal and then out into your amp. Okay, looking at the time here, this whole video is going on way longer than I wanted it to, and honestly, I could go on for another hour about this stuff. Before I leave you with my most important advice, though, here's a rundown of the gear that I use in case you're curious. If you want to hear the sort of tone that I get, listen to the song at the start of this episode, or listen to some of Final Stage's other songs. Granted, that was done with a modded amp and recorded by a professional, Glenn Fricker at Spectre Sound, but the gear I own is essentially the same stuff he owns, and we recorded this stuff with my own guitar. So here goes. For guitars, I own an Ibanez SA220 EXTG and an Ibanez SA220 FM, which is the newer model of the EXTG. I also own an LTD MH1000, and in the past I've owned a Schecter Hellraiser and a Schecter C1 Classic, all of which are fantastic for metal, and all of which have been recorded in our songs at some point. As for heads, as I've already mentioned, for solid state, I have a Randall RH100, which at this point I only use for band practice, but still is a very good amp. My main baby, of course, is my PV5150, and if you're looking for a good metal head, I suggest looking no further than that amp. Again, you get a great tone at a great price, and a lot of studio owners use this to get their tones. When I was a youngster, I bought a 75-watt Line 6 Spider 2 combo amp, which is pretty decent and worked well for band practices. It also has a number of effects built in and a built-in tuner. This is definitely loud enough to have a band practice or even play live with. And if you really need to push it to its max, you can always put it through a PA system. As for cabinets, I own the top and bottom cabinets of a Marshall 1960 lead cabinet. The bottom cabinet has Celestion 30s, the darker sounding ones, which I use for recording and generally stays at my house. The top one has 75s, which I use live, partly because it weighs about half of what the bottom one does, and also has an angled cabinet which allows me to hear it better. As for picks, I've always loved Dunlop .50mm picks. They don't sound quite as heavy, but they make your strings last longer, and personally I've always found those to be the most comfortable. For recording though, I use a pick thicker than 1mm, and for our last record I used a stone pick. That's also the guitar pick they've used on all of Ailstorm's albums, and the guitar tone on that is just incredible. As for strings, I use the D'Addario XL Orange Pack, which are 10 to 46 gauge. GHS boomers I've also used in the past, and if you're planning on down tuning, you'll want to get 52 gauge strings as they tend to sound a little bit heavier. As for cables, I've used dozens of different kinds, but I usually get Yorkville. They tend to be fairly cheap and last a good long time. I always make sure to use a 20-foot cable though, no matter which brand you're looking at. Just make sure whatever you get has the rubber tips at the end and the cable itself seems thick and durable. You shouldn't need to spend more than about $1 per foot of cable, otherwise you're getting ripped off. Cables, if treated properly, and as long as you don't rip them out of your guitar and amp, should last you about a year. One more thing I want to mention about cables, if you're plugging in your head into an amplifier, make sure to get speaker cable, not instrument cable. Speaker cable carries the current that's needed from sending all that power from an amp out into a head. And actually, a lot of times on the back of heads, you'll see warnings telling you not to plug in things like headphones into the parallel output jacks, as all that current can fry whatever it is you're trying to plug into the back. As for acoustic guitars, I've owned a Yamaha in the past, and I currently own an Art & Lutherie, which is a Canadian subsidiary of Godin Guitars. I bought mine for about $200 brand new, and it plays and sounds fantastic. We've mic'd it in a studio setting, and we were very pleased with the results. I do own a lot more gear than what I've talked about here, including pedals, guitars, and a whole bunch of other things, but I don't really use most of it anymore, and I wouldn't recommend most of it for people playing metal guitar, so I'll cut my gear list off there. For a starting musician, here are a couple of things I've owned in the past which make great starting instruments. Ibanez Geos are pretty decent, they play well enough, and they sound good, as long as they've got a humbucker in them. As for an amp, I would try and find a 30-watt Line 6 Spider or a PV Viper if you can find it cheaply enough. Otherwise, Fenders are good starter amps, and again, try to get at least 15 to 20 watts. The starter package, as I've said before, isn't a bad way to go with younger kids and for those mildly interested in learning guitar, but it lacks the longevity should they want to stick with playing guitar for the long term. And if you think they're going to stick with it, I would spend probably $200 to $300, get some decent gear, and it'll be stuff they can stick with for the next several years. And with that, we finally arrive at the most important point in this video. All of the expensive gear in the world is not guaranteed to make you sound exactly like Randy Rhoads, Zakk Wylde, the guys from Avenged Sevenfold, or whoever else. Just because you have the same gear they do doesn't mean you can make the instrument sound the same. The sound is in the hands. A friend and I can play on the same amp with the same settings, same guitar, and when I pass the guitar to him, it never sounds exactly the same. The only way to really emulate the sounds of your heroes is to practice, practice, practice. Precise playing and proper techniques such as squealing, tapping, sweeping, and palm muting correctly are the best ways to become a great player and to get a better sound. All of the gear in the world can't help you if you're playing the wrong notes to begin with. Nowadays, the internet is loaded with tabs, video lessons, and theory. So start learning and practicing as much as possible. I'm reminded of a quote of Eddie Van Halen, who talked about when he started playing guitar, it wasn't really until the guitar bug had bitten him strongly that he began to practice for several hours a day. If you don't know where to get started when it comes to learning, Kim Mitchell's guitar lesson videos are a great place to start. Or, if that still seems too daunting, you can always call a local music store or lesson studio to see if they offer lessons. I hope all of this information helps, and I wish you the best of luck with your next guitar-related purchase.